Well, I'm going to get started now. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to do this introduction. I think most of you know who I am and who we are, but I'll do it anyway, just in case anyone needs a refresher. So I'm Amy Diedrich, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Centre for Sustainable Tropical Fisheries and Aquaculture, the CSTFA, and I'm also the leader of the Livelihoods Lab, and I'd like to welcome you to our joint seminar. So the CSTFA is based at the Babego Yumba campus of JCU in Townsville, and we are a research provider for sustainable tropical fisheries and aquaculture research globally. And the lab is a research group within the CSTFA that seeks to support livelihoods in rural communities in the tropics. So before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the Bindal and Wilgurukuba peoples, who are the original peoples of this country from which we are hosting this meeting, the Townsville region, and pay my respects to their leaders and elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also acknowledge and extend my respect to the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Annah Piggott, who will be speaking about climate change, adaptation, and immobility from her research in Fiji. Anna's a human geographer who is currently working as a research fellow in adaptive governance on the Reef Restoration and Adaptation project at Queensland University of Technology. So you're all muted for this presentation, but feel free to put questions in the chat for our speaker to address once we conclude. And also, once she's done, you can always turn on your mics and ask her questions yourself. So with that, I would like to pass the floor over to Anna. And thanks.
Beautiful. All right, thanks for that introduction, Amy. I'll start by leading on from your acknowledgements and acknowledge the Bundjalung people where I live in northern New South Wales, but also the Turrbal people where I'm currently in Brisbane and where I'm speaking from. Also, I do need to make a slight, maybe offhand comment. I can see myself in the mirror now in the screen, and I can see that it might look like I have a mullet, and nothing against mullets. I'm not trying to grow a mullet. I just haven't been able to get a haircut because I've been in lockdown for months. So yeah, just a slight aside there. Beautiful. So today I'm going to be talking about climate change, adaptation, and immobility. So this is stemming from most of my work as a postdoctoral research fellow at Melbourne University. So I'm currently at Queensland University of Technology, which I started a couple of months ago, working on the Great Barrier Reef. But this work is work that I started during my PhD, which I completed in 2020 from UQ, and then followed through with at Melbourne University. Beautiful, so let's get started. Oh. There we go. So I just wanted to start with a question, which is really what this presentation is about, and something I've been thinking a lot about, you know, with the latest IPCC report and living in the Northern Rivers. You know, there's a lot of, you know, bushfire risk and climate coastal exposure. So I guess I've been reflecting more on it in my own personal life, as well as the research that I've been doing over the last few years. And it's, would you relocate your home and livelihood in the face of severe climate pressures? Because this question is really at the heart of the individual and collective decision making that people are facing throughout Fiji, low-lying communities. This is their lived everyday experience, and something very pertinent. So just starting with a bit of context in terms of what my research is about. So mobility is one form of adaptation, and it's a form that is playing a role in some degree. You know, there's levels of causality in terms of mobility and climate change where the links are somewhat tenuous, but it's definitely plays a role and will continue to play a role going forward. So there's this acknowledgement that climate change will lead to some degree of human mobility, but in saying that, mobility is not inevitable, which is something that I'll explore further throughout some case studies. And yeah, there's three forms of mobility in response to climate change, and these are displacement. So this tends to be smaller scale movement of people, often in response to sudden onset shocks, such as cyclones or other socio-political shocks, but tends to be only temporary. Then we've got migration, which tends to be larger scale, international, more permanent relocations. And there's a lot of research to say that while climate change might feed into some decision making, often migration on this larger scale is driven by, social, political, getting better jobs, really livelihood-based factors. And then planned relocation. So this is where my research in Fiji has centered around. And this is smaller scale movement of communities, either socially or geographically, or moving within social and geographical bounds. So this often tends to be smaller scale in movement and is a real community related mobility. So here's some cases of some planned relocations that have really got significant global attention. So the one on the left here, which is the really grainy one, this is Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana. So this they're under the process of relocation at the moment. So they've got a new site. There's a lot of construction already happening, and people are slowly moving. It's had some severe impacts from sea level rise, but as well as a gas line and pipeline that's been implemented. So there's a lot of other causal factors in terms of what's driven relocation. But this has been a really big coordinated approach across the US. And I'll sort of touch back on this at the end in terms of some lessons that can be learned, because this has actually been a relatively successful case of relocation. I think there are some important lessons that can be drawn from that. In the middle here is Newtok. So this is in Alaska. So Alaska has, I think, 12 to potentially 20 villages that are named and in need of relocation. Newtok's one. They've been planning for about 20 years for relocation, and this is largely driven by melting permafrost and storm surges. And they have moved and they've identified a site about 10 miles away. And the last picture here on the right, that's Grantham, down here near Brisbane in the Lockyer Valley. And they were struck by flooding events in 2011, I believe, and they relocated to a hill slope not far away. So they just pretty much moved the town up. And that was a very successful community-driven relocation initiative. So my research has been focused in Fiji. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the region, but there's about 330 islands that make up Fiji, the largest Viti Levu, and then the second largest being Vanua Levu. And a lot of my research has been on Vanua Levu Island, the pink one at the top there. And Fiji is facing some pretty significant risks with sea level rise and subsequent coastal impacts. So I think some stats or data on sea level rise is that it's since 1992, the sea has been rising at 5.5 millimeters per year, which is roughly twice the global average. So the Pacific Ocean, the sea level, there's obviously regional variations in terms of sea level rise, and areas of the Pacific have been receiving higher than average sea level rise. And then I'm sure we all hear about this in the news as well, but there's a really high cyclone risk in the Pacific, South Pacific Islands especially. So this is damage from Cyclone Pam in 2015, and then there was Winston in 2016, and Fiji sort of gets experiences a lot of the cyclones that come through this region. In terms of relocation in Fiji, so Fiji was the first country in the world to establish relocation plans and guidelines. There's roughly 43 communities listed as in need of government-assisted relocation. I put the roughly because different numbers get reported at different times in different sources. When we were over there earlier this year, so we went over for 2 weeks of fieldwork in the end of February of 2020, so just before COVID really took hold. We were getting messages about, toilet paper not being in the shelves in Australia, and we were kind of like, what's going on? And then we got home and, realized that the world was about to change. But yeah, while we're over there, we got a hold of a list of communities that were documented by the government as in need of relocation. And there was 56 communities on that list. But in saying that, some villages we spoke to wanted to be on the list and they weren't, and they had requested government assistance, whilst others were on the list and were kind of like, no, we don't need help to relocate. So, you know, there's roughly between 40 to 60 communities that have been identified as in need of relocation. But in saying that, there's upwards of 800 to 900 that have been identified as potentially vulnerable and who might need to be relocated in the future. So planned relocation is a really dominant issue in Fiji, and it's something that villages are definitely grappling with, talking about and making decisions on. So to give an overview of what I'm going to be talking about after that background. So the first thing is identifying the diversity of responses to coastal hazard risk from the fieldwork that we've done in Fiji. So looking at what relocation really looks like. Then exploring this idea of autonomous forms of relocation driven by, you know, Indigenous knowledge and decision-making systems and outside of the sort of government processes that are often involved. And the third, I'm going to look at a case study of the role of place-belongingness and that attachment to place when it comes to relocation decision-making, because that's something that's really dominant. Right, so this first piece of research is just being published in Environmental Science and Policy with myself and Celia McMichael. And it's titled The Immobility Relocation Continuum. So this was born out of visiting lots of villages and talking to communities and sort of seeing how different relocation really was amongst and within communities. It wasn't this, you know, village is vulnerable, they move to another location, which tends to be sort of the idea that's generated in our minds when we think of relocation. So I'm just going to explore some of the different types of immobility and relocation that emerged. And these were the 7 case study sites. So as you can see, most are around Vanuatu up there. And then you've got Narikoso down the bottom on our island. And yeah, it's also important to recognise these are rural, subsistence-based communities, you know, with limited infrastructure, you know, limited connections with, you know, broader governance processes. So these are just some pictures from fieldwork. So we've got on the left there, we went out spearfishing and we got to eat that lobster for dinner, which was pretty amazing. That's in Kuroko village. And then sea urchins. This was, I got to taste my first sea urchin in Vandawa. They burn it, the leaves, and then scoop out the sea urchin, which was the first time I'd ever had it. Making sasa brooms in Buningaloa, and then agriculture, which people rely on. So in terms of what relocation and immobility really looks like, so voluntary immobility is something that was occurring within and across villages. So voluntary immobility is really when relocation might be deemed as an option. In this case, this is Kuroko village. The government proposed relocation, but people resisted it, and USAID came in and were going to help with relocation, but they opted for a seawall instead, which has been somewhat successful, somewhat not, depending on where you live in the village. And also there are these other layers of small scale relocation that is happening within the village, but in general, they've decided, at least for the next few years, that they want to remain despite the coastal pressures. Then we've got immobility due to restricted relocation options. So this is Driketi on Gamir Island, just off Tabiuni. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but veering off to the right, you can see that there's a hill slope, and that actually is quite steep. And they've been having pressures from both ends So they've been having pretty severe landslides, mainly from agricultural practices, and also the coast has been slowly eating away at their land. And as you can see, there's an ad hoc seawall there, which there's been iterations of over the years. And we've defined this as immobility due to restricted relocation options in a way to move away from this notion of trapped populations, which is a term that is used across the literature to refer to populations that, you know, are stuck and they want to move, because there's this idea that, you know, people do want to move when you use that word trapped. But talking to people, you know, some people don't want to move regardless of the fact that they don't have options to, but some people do. And then we've got incremental relocation. So this is a picture from Bandawa, and this is a really interesting case study, which I'll talk to a little bit in the next section when I talk about autonomous forms of relocation. So this village doesn't have any help from the government, and they have started their own village directive where each new house needs to move back from the coast. So this was a community built house. You can see their water system at the front there. They're slowly just building new houses with community resources. They've started a new village higher up called Villa Maria. So they see this as their long-term strategy of slowly moving people up. Partial community relocation is probably one of the more common forms of relocation, where government resources might not extend as far as the whole village, and there might not be enough resources and land available. So half of the village is moved, and this creates, you know, a level of social and physical division between those who have moved and those who remain. So this is Denamanu on Yandua Island. They had a really big landslide which destroyed the school from Cyclone Evan in 2013, but they also had pretty severe coastal storm surges from that as well, which washed away 19 houses at the front of the village. So they're the ones that got relocated. And these are the new houses. As you can see, it's very structured and they're all the same color and very different from the organic nature of villages, but at the same time, they all have the same amenities and better amenities than the rest of the village did. So, and then this is Vunidongoloa. So this is full community relocation, which is pretty much a whole village moves from one location to another. So it's that sort of, you know, process which really comes to mind when you think of relocation. And Vunidongoloa is the most well-known case of relocation in Fiji. It got a lot of traction when Fiji hosted COP. A lot of media, they got a lot of media coming in, and they got some livelihood things built in with their relocation. So they got fish ponds, which you can see down the back there, and they got pineapple plantations and cattle. So this was, a very different type, and certainly not what's the norm. So here's just a little diagram showing these different layers of immobility types and relocation types, you know, on this continuum. And I think it's important as well to note that while these are really interesting to show that relocation is a really, you know, heterogeneous process and that there's lots of different types, it's highly diverse. You know, these are really just categorizations that, you know, we've come up with. They're not to say that this is the only ways that relocation happens, nor is it to say that, you know, within villages there can be multiple at multiple different times. It's a really evolving process, especially as climate impacts worsen. So when we look at what factors really lead to these different responses along the continuum, we can see that climate and environmental factors, they play a key role. So how severe climate pressures have been, and this other point of whether thresholds have been met. So for a village at the moment who might be choosing to bunker down and remain in place, that might be the case for now, but in the future, potentially as climate impacts worsen, they're going to have to look to other options. past and current adaptations. So this is a really interesting and important one as well. So, and I'll talk more to this in the next little sections as well, but this idea that, you know, modern day climate change is not in and of itself, you know, the only thing happening. There's this big, deep, broad history of migration and mobility across Fiji that, you know, people have inbuilt in their knowledge systems and their oral histories, and that all plays a really big role in what strategies people will implement today. Also, whether, so relocation is often seen as this last resort adaptation. So whether other in situ adaptations have been successful or not, or have been exhausted, will also indicate, you know, at what time and what type of relocation or immobility villages will be using. So socio-political factors, you know, what the dynamics of the social structure of the community are. Do they have lots of resources? You know, are they well connected? What's their leadership like? You know, these factors are also really important. And land rights and tenure. This is a really, really big one when we talk about relocation more broadly within the Pacific, you know, throughout the world, but especially in Fiji as well. Customary land ownership exists in Fiji, and the ability to move within your own Matangali, which is your clan land, is sort of a pillar for you know, having successful relocation options and reducing those negative impacts from it. If you can move within your own land, you know, it's a much easier process. In saying that, there is this ability to negotiate with surrounding Matangali, which is something that does happen a lot. But if you're very restricted and you don't have those options, I think there's a lot more thought and research, you know, needs to go into that area. So I need to move. I can't see behind myself. Beautiful. And this last one is institutional factors. So is there external assistance available and required? Is it required, and is it in line with community preferences? So these are just some things, you know, you can see with Wunigdongaloa, they had this huge government investment in their relocation. Some might argue there's a political element there in terms of coming up to the COP and having lots of media attention. You know, we're looking after our villages, you know, and, you know, I'm certainly not going to speak too much to that because it's, you know, not really my place, but, you know, that we've certainly seen villages that are, you know, would absolutely love some more government assistance, but are unable to get it. And a lot more of these partial relocations where it's just the village households that have been severely affected that are those that are relocated. Yeah. So this second point here, I'm going to talk about this idea of autonomous relocation from a couple of case studies that we explored, and this idea of generational retreat or generational relocation, which emerged as in Koroko and Bindawa, which was really, you know, these are two villages that haven't had assistance with relocation. And so these were more organic, locally led responses. And they both had similar, you know, experiences with that, which is why we have written about these two villages. So yeah, Koroko was the village with the seawall. They resisted the assistance for relocation. And as I mentioned, there are still some households though that were independently relocating. And Bindawa was the village where they had that really strong village-led directive for relocation in an incremental way. So as I said, I'm just going to, you know, I think this is a really important point to speak to, that mobility is not new. You know, Indigenous populations have extensive knowledge, decision-making systems and practices which have been used and evolved across millennia through adapting to environmental, social, political and cultural changes and perturbations. So yeah, climate change, while it's a modern day, you know, phenomena, it's, people have been adapting to changing climates for a long time. Throughout the Pacific, people have historically moved up the hills and down to coast with the changing sea levels and in search of improved livelihood opportunities. So if you go and talk to any village, 98% can say, before we lived 100 meters, that way, but we moved here 50, 100 years ago, because, the land was degraded there, or we were just searching for better livelihood opportunities. So these are really inbuilt into village lives. So specifically with the Taki communities in Fiji, they have long histories of mobility and retreat stemming back generations, but there's also these more contemporary forms of mobility related to government labour and mobility schemes, where there's a lot in Australia. And there's also this idea that those schemes themselves, can really enhance adaptive capacity through, getting people able to access more incomes. They can potentially be used to set up a life in a new location. Then there's also urban migration, marriage, and all these factors, they're all forms of contemporary mobility. So generational retreat, which is this form of autonomous community relocation, which was occurring within Kuroko and Bandawa. So it's characterized by being an autonomous and self-directed form of relocation rather than a government, just government created and directed form. So it's delineated across generational lines, hence, the term generational retreat. And I think it's not the most vulnerable people who move, but it's younger generations who are seeking not only safety from coastal hazards, but improved livelihood opportunities. So generational retreat is really a process that occurs across generations. So younger people, those wanting to move, but it's also something that will really occur across generations as well, as in it will take, a generation or two before the relocation is completed. And that's largely because older residents don't want to move, to put it bluntly. So what we did was we broke up responses into different age group categories. So we had younger households, we had middle-aged households, and we had older households. And we sort of were talking to them about their preferences for relocation, but also their behaviour around relocation. So amongst the younger adult group, there was predominantly a preference to relocate. Several households already were planning for and initiating the relocation process either independently or through the village directive. So just an example of a quote here is, they had to move because there wasn't enough space to build a house and the rising sea levels keep going up. So this is important too, because it gives an insight, it's not just the fact that sea levels and there's these coastal hazard issues. There's also the fact that there's, these other social, cultural, income, livelihood related factors that are playing on these decisions. So for a lot of younger people, they see it as an opportunity to have a bit more privacy and a bit more, might be closer to the road. So it's this way of escaping coastal hazard risk, but also improving their livelihoods. So amongst the middle-aged group, there was this overriding opinion that relocation is important, yet a range of preferences existed regarding personal options for retreat and relocation, coupled with this consideration that younger generations really need to relocate. So here, this is from Kuroko, where they have the seawall, and it's basically just saying this quote that the seawall is built, they say it's going to last about 30 years. That might be enough for us, but our children, we're seeing these impacts. We're seeing this sea change. We are worried about the future, of the village, and that really people, the younger generation, should be moving. And then amongst the older group, there was this really strong desire to not move, people really didn't want to move. But they also had those strong preferences for the younger generations to move. So this was a quote from a village elder. I think she was the eldest in the village, and she was adamant that there was no way that she was going to move. She wanted to stay where she was. She wanted to die where she was, live out the rest of her life there. Beautiful. All right, and this is the third topic or third case study that I'm going to explore. And this one is work that's under review at the moment, and it's led by Marilisi Yi. She is a PhD student at UQ. She's definitely someone to watch in this space. She's doing her PhD on climate-related relocation. She is a Fiji national, and she's over doing fieldwork at the moment. But yeah, she's awesome. So because we couldn't travel for fieldwork, I was working closely with her to help her, go out and collect data, and analyze it, what within a village near Suva in Tongariro. And this is what I'll talk about now. So Tongariro village is really interesting. So all the other villages I've been talking about are Itake communities, so they're indigenous Fijian communities. Tongariro is of European ancestry. That the story goes that James Dunn, who was from Ireland or Scotland, travelled over in the early 1800s, saw Tongariro Beach, came ashore. He got in contact with the Tuanamosi, who is the provincial chief, and they became friends. James Dunn eventually became a bodyguard to the Tuanamosi. There was a Tongan chief that was trying to take over and fight different Tuan provinces at the time. And then because he helped him with his weapons, he had guns, he gifted him this parcel of land, which is now Tongariro. So I'm just going to quickly show a video, which I thought was useful because not being able to do field work, which I'm sure a lot of you haven't been able to do field work if you work in different countries, having Mary over there and going to visit, and she sent back some videos, and I found it actually quite useful to see what's happening while not being in place. So I'm just going to play it for a minute or so. Let's play from that.
Have you shifted your screen, Anna? Because I think it's still showing the screen where your PowerPoint slides are, as opposed to, how you have to unshare and share the screen.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Thanks for that.
No worries.
All right. Is that better? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, so I'm not sure if you could hear Mary there, but she was saying that the three little things you can see in the water there, the graveyard, that's the graveyard of the village elder, so James Dunn and his immediate descendants. And the village actually used to be further out from where the graveyard is. So it was located behind the graveyard, and they've had to move 100 to 200 meters in over time. And as you can see, the erosion is pretty severe. It is, destroying the coastline at the front and getting up into households at the moment. So in response to this, the village of Tongariro, which is a small village, it's only got 7 households, so it's really quite small. They are implementing a lot of different adaptation strategies. So they're investing in and adapting infrastructure, using innovative farming methods, looking up YouTube to see how they can plant in salty areas. They've created a range of protective barriers over time, lots of different types of seawalls, made of corals, made of tires. They've been restoring and enhancing the natural ecosystem with planting trees. And there's this government proposed seawall at the moment. Here's just some pictures of that. You can see the raised garden bed, the houses being built on stilts, the plantation of coconut trees. And this here, number D, is the proposed outline for where a seawall might go, which is kind of terrifying, I think. Anyway, that's a side note. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just cognizant of my time here at the moment. But what we did was we wanted to look at, beyond the fact that, yes, villagers are choosing to be voluntarily immobile, choosing to stay in place and resist relocation despite, this idea that, it says they're facing severe coastal pressures. We wanted to look at why that was happening, and using this place belongingness framework and all these different components that make up place belongingness. You've got your autobiographical or personal factors, so your personal memories and experiences in a place, your ancestral and historic factors. So these are, which are really important within, Fijian culture, the history and the ancestors play a really big role. The relational and social factors, your interactions with people, your community, cultural factors, language, ritual, that all help, create this idea of who you are and where you belong. Economic, I prefer to think of that as livelihood factors, your ability to get food, water, employment, and also legal factors. So that's around land tenure, really, and having a secure place. So I'm just gonna, I put ancestral and historic there because it's a very important one, but just recognizing time, I'm just going to quickly go through these. So I'm just going to share a quote that sort of represents each of these factors and the role that they play in that sense of place belongingness, which is really tied in with that decision for people to stay where they are. So autobiographical, I'm here to put an anchor down. This is where we're brought up and it's still in our system. People have those really strong personal ties to place. And then there's the relational and social. So this is both, was brought up in terms of this, they share as a community. They were a communal village. But then also this idea that a relocation was proposed that would separate them, and there was no way they were interested in doing that. They needed to stay together as a social network. Cultural factors, so a lot of those were around farming and fishing skills and techniques that had been passed down over the years. And livelihood factors, people have often within Tongariro have lived in different places at different times. But this idea when they come back to Tongariro, it's a place where they can feel safe and they can get enough fish and grow food, even though those things are actually really challenging in the village and have changed a lot over time, it's still, that sense that their livelihoods are connected. And the land security and tenure, because they're of European ancestry, they actually don't have, they're not registered with Atake Affairs for, secure land ownership. And there's a lot, because their land secure is tenuous, there's potential that it's actually being sold off by an ancestor. There's a lot unknown there, but I think because it's so tenuous, they just really want to hold on to it even more. And they're worried that if they move, their children and grandchildren might be kicked out of any new place that they go. And these ancestral and historic places, these were some of the more interesting and really insightful ones, especially because that graveyard is still there, and their ancestors are buried. They have this strong sense that they can't leave them. But there's also this sense that the Tuanamosi gave them, I put the same quote twice, my apologies, I just realized that. But there's a sense that the Tuanamosi gifted them the land, that they have this obligation to the Tuanamosi. And so in summary, so from objectively from outsiders, myself, when I first saw some of the impacts that were happening in this village, relocation seems like an appropriate and necessary response. Yet the community holds a strong sense of place belongingness through personal, cultural, livelihood, legal, social and historic connections to place. And those connections have played really strongly into decisions not to leave at the moment, despite significant current and ongoing future climate risks. So the lesson from that is really relocation initiatives and policies must not only address the ecological, technical, economic and physical aspects, but also account for those intangible place-based connections that inform relocation decision-making. So yeah, just to wrap up, what does this all mean for adaptation and relocation planning, research and practice? And that's probably a big question, which I don't actually think I've answered in my bullet points here, but mainly I've noted some things which I think are really interesting going forward. And this is touching back on this idea of thresholds and tipping points. There's often within hard environmental, sciences, I'm working on the reef at the moment, and this idea that once a threshold's met, once a temperature, of X has been reached, then systems sort of collapse or start to hit a tipping point that we can't go back from. I guess taking that idea into relocation and mobility decision making, understanding where those tipping points exist would be really interesting. For this idea of, which I think is going to be really important for governments in small island states, especially looking at rural communities going forward, is going to be really important, is how to balance this idea of relocation and in situ adaptations. What's necessary when do you invest in a seawall in a rural community, if that's what they really want, despite the fact that seawalls have been shown to be maladaptive, have significant negative implications at times. Like balancing those those two factors going forward will be really important. But yeah, this last question of how can relocation be undertaken in a way that can help sustain intangible connections to place? And this is where lessons from other parts of the world can be really important. So I spoke briefly at the start about Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana in the US. And one thing that they've done is with their relocation plan is they've not just, they're not planning on just moving people. People are able to go back as part, which was something that the community really initiated and stated that was important to them, that they were able to go back and visit the old site until, it's no longer there. That was really built into the relocation plan, so that they could maintain those connections, those place-based connections, even though, they had the realization that they, realistically would need to move to, sustain lives and livelihoods. But yes, that's everything I have. And yeah, happy to take any questions. And thank you for being here.
Thanks, Anna. That was really interesting. Definitely a lot of stuff to think about that I hadn't really thought about before. So thanks for that. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to turn on your videos, mics, put a question in the chat. I will do one while people are thinking. So Bernard says he's in the library. Well, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, Bernard, and I can read them out. So one of the things that struck me and that I've seen with sort of relocation that's happened in response to other things like, displacement from tourism and things like that is that, or from sort of conflict and everything, is that people's livelihoods shift and the sort of resources that they use and have to utilize for their resources changes. And it really struck me when you showed that image of the relocated village where they had their aquaculture ponds and their pineapple farms and stuff. And presumably they would have come from the coast. So they would have been predominantly a fishing community. And I don't know how far they were from the coast, but how well is that managed in Fiji, that sort of transition?
So I think the lucky thing with Fiji and that component is that often the relocations can occur, or when they can occur within customary land, they tend to be smaller scale, so people are able to maintain those connections. But that picture was on Vunidongoloa, and they're about 2 kilometers from the coast. And that's actually something that some of the elders of the village really spoke about, because they can't walk that distance anymore. And there was sort of this real sadness of not hearing the waves and not being able to go out and fish. And the fish ponds are useless. They're like completely useless. People, they don't use them. The kids sort of fish in there. There's not actually built into their livelihoods in any way. So yeah, I think that was more, I guess it was an idea that just didn't really come to fruition. But yeah, that's a really important consideration, and one that most villages won't move if they do have to reconsider or reframe their livelihoods.
I think it's a deficit as well in a lot of programs that help to sort of help people with the relocation, as they don't actually consider like what a significant change is required for people to suddenly shift.
Yeah. But even how small things can make such a big, unintended impact as well. I think that's a thing that doesn't quite, you might think it's not a big deal, but, when it happens, it does end up being a really big deal to, everyday life.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So Bernard, did you notice some diversity in response to disaster risk, climate change, particularly migration within community members with regards to income levels?
Not particularly. I think there was definitely different dynamics across villages themselves, maybe less so in, some villages had more access to income. A lot of people from Koroko, for example, were in labour schemes in Australia and would spend a few months over there. They had really large iguana plantations, and that, I guess, it's not so much in terms of disaster risk reduction, but it was definitely the thing that I noticed was this communal versus individual framing of I guess you could tie that into relocation, adaptation, and disaster risk. But there was definitely this idea that the higher income communities, or people that had more income within the communities, tended to be more individualistic in their, what they would kind of be like, yeah, I can move if I need to, I can go to the city. It's not a big deal, in a certain way. But that would probably be the only thing I could note from that.
And then there's another question from Bernard. Do you think or not the planned migration might potentially create a disincentive for investment in adaptation measures?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and a really interesting one. I think that it could, I mean, it's hard because it is an expensive endeavor in and of itself. So it's not necessarily seen as a, the better, low cost option, because relocating people, it's expensive, and doing it well is expensive. But yeah, that tension between adaptation and migration and relocation is a really important one that needs to be explored, I think.
Cool, thanks. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a question. Thanks, Anna. That was a great talk. I was wondering, you mentioned, you touched a little bit on some of the justice implications of the partial community relocations and who gets to move and that sort of thing. Did you explore much about who's making those decisions and how they're being made in the different places, and what people's preferences are for fairness around relocation?
Yeah, that's that's a really, really great question. Jacqueline, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think with the partial relocation, it often tends to be households that are most affected that will be relocated. In terms of fairness, there were a lot of, I guess, retrospective issues around fairness once people had been relocated, and that was a lot around the resources or the infrastructure and amenities that came with the households that were relocated as opposed to those that weren't, and the division that created. So there was a bit of a social tension in some villages around people who had better houses and better kitchens and better toilets. But on the partial relocations, they tended to be focused on just people who, were those that were immediately affected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So yeah, thank you, Anna. That was really interesting. Thanks for taking the time. Oh no, Shannon, she doesn't have a question. She just put on it. Yeah, thanks so much for talking to us. And yeah, if anyone wants to access any of the papers that you talked about, perhaps they can drop me an email and I can ask you to send them to me or something like that.
Yeah, totally. Or just, anyone can get in contact with me anytime. I'm sure.
Yeah, or just go ahead and
online. Yeah.
Well, your email is not on the bottom, but maybe can we put it in the chat, or we can share it?
Yeah. Oh, hold on. I've got to remember it. I've had too many emails lately with either Anna or just an A, so I get confused. But yeah, if anyone does have any questions, obviously my door's open. I'd love to chat. And yeah, hopefully it would also be nice to hear about what everyone's doing up there at JCU as well, within your lab and your group. I've heard it's a really good place to be.
We can add you to the mailing list if you want, so you can join seminars like this if you feel like it. And
oh yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, well, thanks everyone for joining, and see you soon.
Yeah.